You're telling me that the great Raphael Bruno has been lying to me for 15 years? Rocco's voice cut through the silence of their private office like a blade through silk. His twin stood by the window overlooking the Naples harbor, hands clenched behind his back, shoulders rigid with tension that had nothing to do with the family business, and everything to do with the confession he'd just made. "Not lying," Raphael said quietly, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. "Protecting." "Protecting?" Rocco's laugh was sharp, humorless. "Protecting me from what, exactly?" "From knowing that my brother, my twin, my other half, has been carrying this secret like a disease." Raphael turned then, and the raw emotion on his face made Rocco take an involuntary step back. In 32 years of shared existence, of finishing each other's sentences and knowing each other's thoughts before they were spoken, Rocco had never seen his brother look so utterly broken. "I've loved her since she was 13 years old," Raphael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Does that make me a monster, Rocco? Does it? Because I've asked myself that question every single day for 15 years. The office fell silent, except for the distant sound of ships in the harbor and the tick of their father's antique clock. Rocco moved to the bar cart, poured 2 glasses of their best whiskey, and handed one to his twin. They stood there, separated by 3 feet of Persian carpet and a chasm of unspoken truths. "Tell me," Rocco said finally, "from the beginning." And so Raffaele began. It had been the night after Lucia Castellano's funeral, on a sweltering August evening when grief hung over Naples like smoke. The Castellanos were rivals then, not enemies, but not allies either. And attendance at the funeral had been a political courtesy from Don Marco Bruno. 17-year-old Raphael had been restless, unable to sleep, and had walked down to the harbor where the family kept their private boats. That's where he'd found her. Vittoria Castellano, just 13, still in her funeral dress, sitting on the edge of the dock with her feet dangling over the water. She wasn't crying anymore. Raphael suspected she'd run out of tears, but she was shaking despite the summer heat, her small body racked with silent tremors that spoke of a grief too large for her young frame to contain. Raphael had known he should leave. Every instinct of self-preservation, every lesson his father had drilled into him about maintaining distance from rival families, told him to walk away. But something in the curve of her shoulders, the way she sat so utterly alone in the world, had anchored his feet to the dock. "You shouldn't be here," he'd said, his 17-year-old voice still cracking occasionally with adolescence. "This is Bruno territory." She hadn't looked up. "I don't care." "Your father will be looking for you." "My father hasn't looked at me since my mother got sick." Her voice was hollow, scraped clean of emotion. "He won't start now that she's dead." Raphael should have left then. He knew it, even at 17. But instead he sat down beside her, maintaining a careful distance, and said nothing. They sat like that for hours, until the moon rose over the Mediterranean and the summer night finally began to cool. She never cried again, never spoke again, but eventually her shaking stopped. When the sky began to lighten with dawn, she finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, and in their depths, Raphael saw something that made his adolescent heart stutter. A recognition, as if she saw him, truly saw him, in a way no one else ever had. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "Because no one should be alone when they're hurting," he'd answered, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and handing it to her. "Not even a Castellano?" She'd taken the handkerchief, running her fingers over the embroidered RB in the corner. "Will you tell anyone you found me here?" "No." "Promise?" "I promise." She'd stood then, and smoothing her wrinkled funeral dress, and looked down at him with an expression far too old for her 13 years. "Thank you, Raphael Bruno. I won't forget this." Then she'd walked away, disappearing into the morning light, and Raphael had sat there watching the sunrise and feeling something shift fundamentally in his chest. It wasn't love, not then. She was too young, he was too young, and he wasn't a monster. But it was the seed of something that would grow in secret, watered by guilt and hope, and the absolute certainty that one day, when she was old enough, when the world had turned enough times to make it right, he would love her with everything he had. "I never told you," Raphael said now, draining his whiskey, "because I knew what you'd say, that I was obsessed, that I'd built a fantasy around a girl I'd met once, for one night, when she was grieving and vulnerable. And maybe you'd have been right." Rocco refilled both glasses. "But you didn't forget her." "How could I?" Raphael's laugh was bitter. "I watched her from a distance, Rocco. Not like some stalker. I never approached her again, never contacted her. But I knew things. I knew when she graduated from university. I knew when her father died, and she took over the vineyard. I knew when she turned it from a dying legacy into an empire. I knew when she cut ties with every mafia family in Naples and went completely legitimate. I knew everything, and I told myself I was just being cautious, gathering intelligence on a potential business partner. But that was a lie. And then she walked into our conference room 2 weeks ago," Rocco said softly. "And then she walked into our conference room," Raphael echoed. 28 years old, brilliant, successful, so beautiful it hurt to look at her. And I realized that I'd been waiting 15 years for that exact moment. 15 years of telling myself that what I felt was just protective instinct, just guardianship, just anything other than what it really was, which is, Raphael met his twin's eyes, love. Real, consuming, terrifying love. The kind our father warned us about. The kind that makes men stupid and gets families destroyed. I love her, Rocco. I've loved her since she was too young to understand what that meant, and I hate myself for it." Rocco was quiet for a long moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass and watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "That night in the parking garage, what did you say to her?" "I asked if she remembered me." Raphael's lips quirked in a sad smile. She said, "The boy who sat with me by the harbor. I've remembered you every day." Then she pulled that old handkerchief from her purse, 15 years old, Rocco, yellowed and worn, and she said, "I've been waiting for you to come back for it." The implication hung in the air between them. Vittoria Castellano, the woman who had walked away from the mafia world entirely, who had built walls around herself and her business that no criminal family could penetrate, had been waiting. For Raphael. For 15 years. "So what now?" Rocco asked. "Now?" Raphael set down his glass with careful precision. "Now I do what I should have done 2 weeks ago. I put distance between us. I let you handle all future negotiations with Castellano Vineyards. I stay away from her before I destroy everything, her reputation, our family's standing, my own sanity. Is that what you want?" "It doesn't matter what I want." "It does to me." Rocco moved closer, placing a hand on his twin's shoulder. "Raphael, in all our years, in all the wars we've fought and the enemies we've buried, I've never seen you like this. If she..." The office door burst open, cutting off whatever Rocco had been about to say. Their youngest brother, 19-year-old Marco, stood in the doorway, face flushed from running. "We've got a problem," Marco gasped. "Antonio Greco just called an emergency meeting of the underbosses. He's making some kind of accusation against our family, and Father wants you both in the conference room immediately." Rocco and Raphael exchanged a glance. Years of shared battlefield instinct snapping into place. Personal matters would have to wait. Family came first. It always had. But as they followed Marco down the hallway toward the conference room, where their father and the family's most trusted men were gathering, Rocco's mind was racing. Antonio Greco was ambitious, ruthless, and had been making moves to consolidate power within the organization for months. If he was calling an emergency meeting, it meant he thought he had ammunition, something big enough to challenge the twins' authority, or worse, their father's leadership. The conference room was already full when they entered. Don Marco Bruno sat at the head of the table, his aged face impassive but his eyes sharp as ever. Sitting around the table sat 10 of the family's most senior members, and at the far end, standing with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards, was Antonio Greco. "Ah, the twins," Antonio said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "So glad you could join us. We were just discussing some interesting irregularities in our shipping manifests." "Get to the point, Antonio," Don Marco said, his voice still carrying the authority that had kept the Bruno family at the top of Naples' hierarchy for 40 years. Antonio laid a folder on the table, sliding it toward the Don. "Someone has been using our shipping routes to move product that doesn't belong to us. Weapons, specifically. High-grade military equipment that's being smuggled through our ports to political extremists. The kind of cargo that, if discovered by the authorities, would bring down not just our organization, but every family we do business with." The room erupted in murmurs. Rocco kept his face carefully neutral, but his mind was already working through the implications. Weapons trafficking wasn't their business. Don Marco had always drawn a hard line against it, considering it too much heat for too little profit. If someone was using Bruno routes for arms smuggling, it was either without the family's knowledge or, "You're suggesting someone in this family is running an unauthorized operation," Raphael said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I'm not suggesting anything," Antonio replied smoothly. "I'm presenting facts. The manifests show regular shipments over the past 6 months, all routed through ports under Bruno control, all with false declarations, all moving through a particular warehouse network." He paused for effect. Castellano Vineyards warehouse network, to be specific. Rocco's blood turned to ice. Across the table, he saw Raphael's hands clench into fists. "Vittoria Castellano has nothing to do with this family's business," Rocco said carefully. "Doesn't she?" Antonio's smile widened. "Funny thing about that. Our intelligence suggests that certain members of this family have been meeting with Miss Castellano regularly over the past 2 weeks. Private meetings, unofficial negotiations. One might wonder what exactly is being discussed in those meetings, especially given that her warehouses are now linked to illegal weapons trafficking." The accusation was clear. Either Raphael had been running an unauthorized weapons operation through Vittoria's business, or he'd been compromised by her, or both. Either way, it cast suspicion on the twins and, by extension, on Don Marco's leadership. Don Marco's face remained impassive, but Rocco knew his father well enough to see the calculation happening behind those sharp eyes. This wasn't just about the weapons. This was Antonio making a play for power, using Vittoria as the knife and Raphael's feelings as the weakness to exploit. "Where did you get this intelligence?" Rocco demanded. "Sources I trust," Antonio said vaguely. "But the evidence speaks for itself. Either someone in this family is running weapons through an unauthorized channel and framing Miss Castellano, or Miss Castellano is running weapons and has compromised a member of this family. Either way, it's a problem that needs to be addressed. Immediately. We'll investigate, Don Marco said, his tone brooking no argument. Rocco Raphael, I want a full audit of all shipping manifests for the past year. I want to know every container that moved through our ports and where it ended up. And I want to know exactly what your relationship with Vittoria Castellano entails. It was a command, not a request. The twins nodded in unison. In the meantime, Don Marco continued, turning to Antonio, you will not make any moves against the Castellano business or Miss Castellano herself. If she's innocent, dragging her into this will make enemies we don't need. If she's guilty, we handle it quietly. Are we clear? Antonio inclined his head, but the satisfaction in his eyes was unmistakable. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. Cast doubt on the twins' judgment. He created a crisis that required immediate attention and positioned himself as the vigilant protector of family interests. The meeting adjourned, and the room emptied quickly. Only Don Marco and his sons remained. Tell me the truth, the old man said once they were alone. Both of you. What's really going on with the Castellano woman? Rocco looked at Raphael, who seemed to have aged a decade in the past hour. His twin's face was pale, jaw clenched so tight that Rocco could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. I'm in love with her, Raphael said flatly, but she has nothing to do with weapons trafficking. Vittoria went legitimate after her father died. She wants nothing to do with our world. Someone is setting her up to get at us. Don Marco studied his son for a long moment. And you? He asked, turning to Rocco. What's your assessment of the situation? Rocco chose his words carefully. Antonio has been positioning himself for a power play for months. This is it. He's created a crisis that makes us look compromised, and him look competent. Whether the weapons trafficking is real or fabricated, it's a means to an end. And the Castellano woman? Rocco hesitated. He could feel Raphael's eyes on him, could sense his twins' desperate hope that Rocco would defend Vittoria. And the truth was, despite having met her only once, during that business negotiation 2 weeks ago, Rocco's instincts told him she was exactly what she appeared to be. A legitimate businesswoman who'd escaped the mafia world and wanted no part of it. But there was something else. Something Rocco had barely admitted to himself. During that negotiation, when Vittoria had sat across from him and calmly, brilliantly negotiated terms that were fair to both parties without giving an inch more than necessary, when she'd met his hardball tactics with grace and steel, and even made him laugh once with a dry observation about masculine posturing, he'd felt something shift inside him. It wasn't love, not like what Raphael described, but it was fascination, respect, a pull toward her that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with the fact that she was possibly the most intriguing woman he'd ever met. I think she's innocent, Rocco said finally, and I think we need to prove it before Antonio uses this to tear the family apart. Don Marco nodded slowly. Then prove it. You have 48 hours to audit those shipping manifests and clear her name. If you can't... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. If they couldn't clear Vittoria, she would become a liability. And the Bruno family didn't tolerate liabilities. The twins left their father's office and headed straight for the records room. They worked in silence, pulling manifests, cross-referencing container numbers, tracking shipments through the labyrinthine network of legitimate and illegitimate cargo that moved through Bruno-controlled ports. It was Raphael who found it, 6 hours into their search. A pattern. Shipments that showed up on Bruno manifests, but not on Castellanos. Routed through her warehouses, but with forged signatures on the receiving documents. Someone had been using Vittoria's business as a front, making it look like she was complicit while keeping her completely in the dark. "Who has access to forge these signatures?" Raphael asked, his voice tight with controlled rage. Rocco studied the documents, his analytical mind piecing together the puzzle. "Someone with access to both our shipping systems and Castellano's warehouse schedules. Someone who could move cargo through without her knowledge. Someone with the authority to alter manifests without raising red flags." They stared at each other as the realization hit them simultaneously. "Antonio," they said in unison. It made perfect sense. Antonio controlled several of the family's port operations. He had the access, the authority, and the motivation. He'd been running weapons through Vittoria's warehouses to build a war chest for his power play. And when the time was right, he'd exposed it, framing both Vittoria and implying that Raphael was either complicit or compromised. "We need proof," Rocco said. "These manifests show someone is framing her, but they don't prove it's Antonio. Then we get proof." Raphael's voice was cold, deadly. "And we make him pay for dragging her into this." But even as they planned their next move, Rocco's phone buzzed with an alert from their security team. His blood ran cold as he read the message. "Raphael," he said quietly, "we have a bigger problem." "What?" Rocco turned his phone so his twin could see the security alert. "Antonio's men just mobilized. They're heading toward Castellano Vineyards. All of them." The implication was clear. If Antonio was making a move against Vittoria, it meant he was ready to eliminate the evidence and the witness before the twins could prove anything. They ran. Vittoria Castellano was alone when the first window shattered. She'd been in her villa's study, reviewing next quarter's export contracts by lamplight, when the sound of breaking glass echoed through the house. Her security chief, a retired police officer named Giuseppe, appeared in the doorway within seconds, his face grim. "Miss Castellano, we have uninvited guests. 4 vehicles approaching from the main road, and they're not slowing down at the gate." Vittoria's hand went to the desk drawer where she kept the pistol her father had given her on her 18th birthday. The only piece of his world she'd kept when she'd walked away from the mafia life. She'd never had to use it, until now. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I don't know yet, but—" Another crash, this time from the back of the house. Giuseppe's radio crackled with panicked voices from the security team outside. Vittoria could hear the distinct sound of gunfire, brief and controlled. Warning shots or suppressing fire, she couldn't tell which. Then the study door burst open again, and 2 men she'd never seen before rushed in. They weren't her security. The guns in their hands made their intentions clear. "Miss Castellano," the taller one said, his smile predatory. "You're coming with us. Don't make this difficult." Vittoria's fingers closed around the pistol in the drawer. She was under no illusions about her chances in a gunfight against trained men. But her father had taught her one valuable lesson. Never surrender power without resistance. The moment you became an easy target, you became a disposable one. "I don't think so," she said, pulling the pistol and aiming it at the speaker with both hands, her stance textbook perfect. "Get out of my house." The men laughed. The shorter one raised his weapon, and Vittoria realized with terrible clarity that they weren't here to kidnap her cleanly. They were here to make a statement. Blood on expensive carpets sent a message that merely abducting someone didn't. Then the entire villa shook with an impact that knocked pictures off the walls. The sound was massive, violent, a vehicle ramming through something solid. The two men's heads whipped toward the hallway, their certainty evaporating into confusion. "What the hell?" the tall one started. He never finished. The study's bay window exploded inward in a shower of glass as a figure dove through it, rolled across the floor, and came up with a gun in each hand. Raphael Bruno looked like something out of a violent prayer. Face set in lines of absolute focus, eyes burning with protective fury, moving with the grace of a man who'd been training for combat since childhood. He shot the taller man in the shoulder before the attacker could even turn his weapon. The shorter one managed to get off a round that went wide, splintering the doorframe. Raphael's return shot was precise, disarming without killing. Both attackers went down screaming. "Vittoria, move!" Raphael shouted, and she did on pure instinct, dropping behind her desk just as more gunfire erupted from the hallway. Through the chaos, another figure appeared, this one coming through the actual doorway rather than the window. Rocco Bruno moved with his twin's efficiency, but with a different quality. Where Raphael was fire, Rocco was ice. Calculated. Methodical. He cleared the hallway with 3 shots, each one finding exactly the target it needed to find, and then he was at Vittoria's desk, one hand extended to help her up. "Are you hurt?" Rocco demanded, his eyes scanning her for injuries, even as he kept his weapon trained on the doorway. "No, what's happening? Why are you here?" "Saving your life," Raphael growled, zip-tying the 2 men he'd shot. "You can thank us later. Right now we need to move." The gunfire outside had intensified. Vittoria could hear Giuseppe's voice shouting orders to the security team, but they were clearly outgunned. Whoever had sent these men had sent enough to overwhelm her small security force. "My team," she started, "is falling back to the south gate on my order," Rocco interrupted, already moving toward the hallway. "We radioed them before we breached your property. They'll regroup and support our exit, but we need to go now." "Your car's armored?" Raphael asked, jerking his head toward the garage visible through another window. "Yes, but keys." Vittoria grabbed them from her desk, her mind still struggling to process what was happening. The Bruno twins, whom she'd seen exactly once in the past 15 years, until 2 weeks ago, were now in her study, bleeding from minor cuts from the shattered window glass, having just fought off armed attackers. The surreal quality of it all made her wonder if she was dreaming. Then Rocco's hand closed around her wrist, warm and solid and absolutely real, and he was pulling her toward the hallway. "Stay between us. Don't stop moving, unless we tell you to stop." They moved as a unit, Rocco leading, Vittoria in the middle, Raphael covering their rear. The villa's hallways, which Vittoria had walked thousands of times, now felt like a war zone. There were bodies. Her security team had fought harder than she'd realized, and bullet holes in walls that had stood since her grandfather's time. They reached the garage without encountering more resistance. Vittoria's armored Mercedes sat exactly where she'd left it that evening, a lifetime ago, when her biggest concern had been export tariffs. "I'm driving," Rocco announced, taking the keys from her hand. "Back seat," Raphael added, guiding Vittoria toward the rear door. "Stay down once we're moving." The garage door opened with agonizing slowness. Outside, Vittoria could see the chaos of the attack. Her security team trading fire with at least a dozen attackers, vehicles burning in her driveway. The beautiful landscaping she'd spent years perfecting, torn apart by bullets and boots. Then they were moving, the Mercedes armored bulk smashing through the garage door before it had fully opened, the impact barely registering through the reinforced chassis. Rocco drove like a man possessed, threading the narrow gap between a burning van and the villa's fountain, using every inch of available space to avoid the attackers. Bullets hammered against the windows and body panels. A sound like hail on metal, but the armor held. Raphael had his window down, returning fire with controlled bursts that forced the attackers to take cover rather than aim carefully. Within seconds, they'd broken through the perimeter and were racing down the villa's tree-lined driveway toward the main road. Vittoria watched through the rear window as her home disappeared behind them, flames now visible through several windows. Everything she'd built, the sanctuary she'd created away from the violence of the mafia world, was burning. "Who were they?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Antonio Greco's men," Rocco said, his eyes fixed on the road. "One of our family's underbosses. He's making a play for power, and you got caught in the middle." "Why?" "I have nothing to do with your family's business. Someone's been using your warehouse network to smuggle weapons," Raphael explained, twisting in his seat to look at her. "High-grade military equipment moving through your facilities with forged documentation. It was set up to look like you were complicit, which would discredit us for having business relationships with you. Classic setup." "That's insane. I review every shipment personally. I would have noticed—" "You weren't supposed to notice," Rocco interrupted. "The shipments were listed as wine exports on your end, with documentation that looked completely legitimate. Only the Bruno family manifests showed what was really being shipped. Antonio made it look like you were our partner in weapons trafficking." Vittoria's mind raced, pieces clicking into place. The quarterly reports she'd reviewed had shown slight variations in container weights, small enough to attribute to packaging differences, but consistent enough that she'd made a note to investigate. She'd been planning to audit the warehouse records next week. Next week. She almost laughed at the absurdity. Next week, she'd probably have been arrested or dead. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, as Rocco turned onto a mountain road leading away from Naples. "Somewhere safe," Raphael said. "Our family's estate in the mountains. It's been fortified for situations exactly like this. Antonio can't touch you there." "And then what?" "I just hide while you two fight your family war." The brothers exchanged a glance in the rearview mirror, one of those wordless communications that twins seem to manage effortlessly. "Then," Rocco said carefully, "we figure out how to clear your name, prove Antonio's guilt, and make sure you can go back to your life without a target on your back." "That simple?" "No," Raphael admitted. "It's going to be complicated and dangerous, and will probably require you to trust us completely, despite having every reason not to. But it's the only option that keeps you alive." Vittoria leaned back against the leather seat, her pistol still in her hand, and studied the two men who'd just torn her life apart while saving it. Rocco, focused and controlled even now, driving with the same precision he probably applied to everything in his life. Raphael, still checking the road behind them for pursuit, his profile sharp against the passing streetlights. The boy who'd sat with her by the harbor, somehow contained within this dangerous man. "I have questions," she said finally. "We have time," Rocco replied. "It's a 3-hour drive to the estate." So Vittoria asked, and the brothers answered. They explained about Antonio's ambition, about the audit that had revealed the smuggling operation, about the emergency meeting that had exposed the setup. They explained their father's 48-hour deadline to clear her name, and how that timeline had collapsed when Antonio decided to eliminate the evidence, meaning her, permanently. What they didn't explain, at least not explicitly, was why they'd come themselves instead of sending a security team. Why Raphael had driven through a window to reach her. Why Rocco's hands had shaken, just slightly, when he'd checked her for injuries. But Vittoria was her father's daughter, trained from childhood to read people and situations, and she understood. Whatever was happening here was personal, for both of them, The estate appeared as they crested a mountain ridge, a sprawling compound of stone and iron that had probably stood since Naples was young. Guard towers bracketed the main gate, and Vittoria counted at least a dozen armed men patrolling the perimeter. This wasn't a house. It was a fortress. "Home, sweet home," Raphael murmured as the gates swung open to admit them. They parked in a courtyard that could have held 20 vehicles. Don Marco Bruno himself was waiting on the steps of the main house, flanked by men Vittoria recognized from news reports and whispered stories. The inner circle of the Bruno family's power structure. The old Don's face was impassive as they emerged from the Mercedes, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Not the cuts on his sons' faces from the broken window glass, not the way they positioned themselves on either side of Vittoria as they approached, not the way she held herself, scared but not broken, angry but not hysterical. "Miss Castellano," Don Marco said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned over decades. "Welcome to our home. I apologize that the circumstances of your arrival are so unfortunate." "Don Bruno," Vittoria replied, refusing to be intimidated. "Your underboss just tried to have me killed. I assume you're going to do something about that?" The corner of the old man's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close to approval. "Direct. I like that. Yes, Miss Castellano. I intend to do something about that. But first, we need to ensure your safety and clear your name. My sons tell me you're innocent of these weapons trafficking charges." "I am." "Then you'll submit to questioning by my people? Allow us access to your warehouse records, your shipping manifests, your communications?" It was a test, Vittoria realized. A legitimate businessman would hesitate, would lawyer up, would demand guarantees. But in the mafia world, cooperation was survival. "I'll give you access to everything," she said, "on one condition." Don Marco raised an eyebrow. Around the courtyard, several of his men shifted, hands moving toward weapons. Making conditions to a Don was bold to the point of stupidity. "When this is over," Vittoria continued, "when you've cleared my name and dealt with Antonio Greco, I walk away. No obligations, no debt, no ties to your family or your business. I go back to my vineyards and my legitimate life, and we forget this ever happened." The silence stretched. Don Marco studied her with those sharp eyes, and Vittoria held his gaze without flinching. She'd learned that from her father, too. Never show fear to predators. Finally, the old Don nodded. "Agreed. You cooperate fully. We clear your name, and you're free to return to your life with no obligations. You have my word." "Then you have my cooperation." Don Marco gestured toward the house. "Lucia will show you to your rooms. We'll begin the investigation in the morning. For tonight, rest. You're safe here." A woman in her 50s appeared, kind-faced and efficient, and led Vittoria inside. The twins moved to follow, but their father's voice stopped them. "Not you two. We need to talk." Vittoria glanced back once before disappearing into the house, and saw the brothers standing before their father, like soldiers awaiting judgment. Whatever conversation was about to happen, she suspected it had less to do with weapons trafficking and more to do with the way both men had looked at her in the car, with an intensity that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with something far more dangerous. The room Lucia led her to was beautiful. High ceilings, antique furniture, windows overlooking the mountains. There were fresh clothes laid out on the bed, toiletries in the bathroom, everything she might need. A prison, however gilded, was still a prison. But as Vittoria stood at the window, watching the lights of Naples twinkling in the valley below, She found herself thinking not about escape, but about Raphael's face when he'd burst through that window. The absolute focus, the protective fury, the way he'd positioned himself between her and danger without a moment's hesitation. And Rocco's hands, checking her for injuries with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about the ruthless strategist who'd negotiated their business deal with surgical precision. Two men, two brothers, both dangerous, both looking at her like she was something precious worth protecting. Vittoria touched the pocket where she still carried that 15-year-old handkerchief, yellowed and worn, but never forgotten. She'd told Raphael she'd been waiting for him to come back for it, and that had been true. But what she hadn't told him was that she'd been waiting to see if the boy who'd sat with her in her grief had survived becoming a man in the mafia world. Now she knew. He had survived. They both had, in different ways, and somehow, impossibly, she was caught between them. "This is going to get complicated," she whispered to her reflection in the window. Outside, thunder rumbled over the mountains, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Vittoria woke to voices outside her door, not shouting. The Bruno brothers were too controlled for that, but raised enough that she could make out individual words through the heavy wood. "Impossible. Father's right. Can't ask her to choose. Won't put her through this." She checked the antique clock on the nightstand. 4 a.m. She'd slept fitfully. Dreams full of fire and broken glass and twin faces that shifted between protection and something darker, more consuming. The voices fell silent as she opened the door. Rocco and Raphael stood in the hallway, both clearly having not slept, both wearing expressions that suggested the conversation she'd interrupted had been both necessary and painful. "Miss Castellano," Rocco said formally, as if they hadn't spent 3 hours in a car together the previous night. "We apologize for disturbing you." "Vittoria," she corrected, moving past formality because she was tired of the dance they were all doing. "And you weren't disturbing me. I was already awake." Raphael's eyes searched her face. "Nightmares? Realistic concerns about my entire life being destroyed by a power struggle I didn't ask to be part of," she replied. "Close enough to nightmares. What's happening? Have you found proof against Antonio?" The brothers exchanged that look again, the one that spoke volumes in a language only twins understood. "We've found proof," Rocco said carefully. "Financial records showing Antonio's been siphoning family money to fund his weapons operation for months. Communications between him and the buyers. Shipping manifests with his authorization codes that prove he was running the operation through your warehouses without your knowledge." "That's good news, isn't it?" "It would be," Raphael said, his voice tight. "Except Antonio knows we're onto him. He's called a meeting of the 5 families for tomorrow night. He's going to accuse our father of losing control, use the weapons trafficking scandal as proof, and make a bid for leadership of the organization." Vittoria's political instincts, honed by years of navigating legitimate business waters, immediately grasped the implications. "And if he succeeds," Rocco said, "he becomes the most powerful crime boss in southern Italy. Our family is either absorbed into his organization or destroyed. And you, as a witness who can testify to his illegal operation, become a permanent liability he'll eliminate. So we stop him." Vittoria made it sound simple because, in theory, it was. "You have proof. You present it to these 5 families, expose him, and he's finished." "It's not that simple," Raphael said. "Antonio has spent months building alliances, calling in favors, positioning himself as the strong leader the families need in changing times. He's popular with the younger members who think our father's methods are outdated. Proof of his crimes might not be enough to turn them against him if they believe his vision for the future is stronger than ours. Then what do you need? Vittoria asked. What would be enough? The brothers were silent for a long moment. Then Rocco said quietly, You. Vittoria blinked. Excuse me? Your testimony, Rocco clarified. If you stand before the 5 families and explain how Antonio used your business without your knowledge, how he manufactured evidence to frame both you and our family, how he tried to have you killed to cover his tracks. That personal testimony from a legitimate businesswoman with no ties to organized crime carries weight that documents alone don't. You want me to testify at a mafia tribunal? Vittoria's laugh was slightly hysterical. The thing I've spent 5 years avoiding any connection to. The world I walked away from when my father died. You want me to walk right back into it? We're asking, Raphael said, and the pain in his voice made Vittoria's chest tighten. Not demanding. Never demanding. But yes, we're asking you to help us stop a man who will absolutely kill you if he gains power, and will probably kill a lot of other people too. Vittoria moved to the window, watching the sun begin to rise over the mountains. The estate looked beautiful in the dawn light, peaceful even. A lie, like so much of the mafia world, was a lie dressed up in old stone and older traditions. If I do this, she said slowly, if I testify and help you expose Antonio, what happens to me afterward? Your father promised I could walk away with no obligations. But we both know that's not how this world works. Once I'm involved, once I'm known to the 5 families, I'm always involved. She turned to face them, and the expressions on their faces, guilt and hope, and something else she couldn't quite name, told her they'd already considered this. We protect you, Rocco said. Permanent protection, resources, relocation if you want it, though we'd prefer you didn't leave Naples. Why would you prefer that? Vittoria demanded, though part of her already knew the answer. Raphael stepped closer, and Vittoria's breath caught at the intensity in his eyes. Because I've waited 15 years to tell you that I love you, and I don't want to wait another 15 to see you again. Because when I thought Antonio's men might kill you last night, something in me broke that I don't think will ever be fixed. Because you asked me why I stayed with you that night by the harbor, and I told you no one should be alone when they're hurting. But the truth is, I stayed because even at 17, even when you were far too young and it was completely wrong, I knew I'd found something I'd spend my whole life looking for. The confession hung in the air between them like a living thing. Vittoria's heart hammered against her ribs, emotions warring in her chest, shock and fear, and underneath it all, a truth she'd been denying even to herself. Raphael, she started. Let me finish, he said gently. You told me you've been waiting for me to come back for that handkerchief. I need you to understand what that means to me. It means that maybe, possibly, you felt something too. Even if it was just gratitude. Even if it was just recognition of a kindness when you needed it most. But if there's any chance it was more than that, I'm asking you to give us, a chance to explore what this could be. Us. Vittoria's eyes moved to Rocco, who had been silent during his brother's confession. Rocco's expression was carefully controlled, but Vittoria was learning to read the micro-expressions that betrayed his thoughts. Raffaele has loved you longer, he said quietly. He saw you first. He has the prior claim, in every way that matters. I won't interfere with that. That's not what I asked, Vittoria pressed. I asked about us. What did Raphael mean by us? The brothers looked at each other, and in that moment, Vittoria saw something she'd missed before. They weren't just brothers, or even just twins. They were 2 halves of a whole, so intrinsically connected that one's feelings inevitably bled into the others. "I met you 2 weeks ago," Rocco said, his voice careful, measured. "One business meeting where you were brilliant and challenging and made me actually enjoy a negotiation for the first time in years. That's not love. That's not what Raphael feels, but it's something. Fascination, respect. The beginning of something that could become more, given time. And I would be lying if I said I didn't feel it." "So you both..." Vittoria couldn't finish the sentence. "We both feel something for you," Raphael confirmed. "But I would never ask you to choose between us, or to somehow split yourself between two relationships. That's not fair to you or sustainable for any of us. What I'm asking is for a chance. One chance to see if what I've felt for 15 years is something you could feel too." Vittoria's mind was reeling. This was insane. She'd come to that business meeting 2 weeks ago planning to negotiate shipping rates, and now she was standing in a mafia fortress being confessed to by twin brothers who'd saved her life and were asking her to risk everything by testifying against a dangerous underboss. And underneath the insanity, underneath the fear and confusion, was the memory of a 17-year-old boy sitting beside her in the dark, asking for nothing, offering comfort when she had nothing left. That memory had sustained her through her father's death, through the brutal years of building her business, through every moment when she'd been alone and struggling. "I'll testify," she said finally, "not because of whatever this is between us, between the three of us, but because Antonio Greco tried to destroy me, tried to use me, and I don't let men like that win. I'll help you expose him." Relief flooded both brothers' faces, but Vittoria held up a hand. "But after the testimony, after this is done, I need time. Time to process what you've said. Time to figure out what I feel without my life being in immediate danger. Can you give me that?" "As long as you need," Raphael said immediately. "And in the meantime," Rocco added, "we keep you safe. No matter what you decide about us." The next 36 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Vittoria reviewed her warehouse records with the Bruno family's accountants, identifying every shipment that had been manipulated. She gave statements to Don Marco's most trusted advisors, laying out exactly how Antonio had used her business. She practiced her testimony, learning how to present information to the 5 families in a way that would carry maximum impact. Through it all, the twins were constant presences. Rocco helped her organize the evidence, his strategic mind identifying the most damning details and the most effective way to present them. Raphael stood guard, his protective instincts never quite settling even within the fortress walls. And late at night, when the preparation was done and exhaustion should have claimed her, Vittoria found herself in the estate's library with one or both brothers talking. Not about the case or the testimony, but about life. Rocco showed her his architectural drawings, elaborate buildings he designed as a mental exercise, each one more beautiful than the last. Raphael played piano, his fingers coaxing melodies from the old instrument that spoke of longing and hope. They told her stories about growing up as twins in a mafia family, about the pressure and the violence and the strange code of honor that governed their world. She told them about her mother's death, about her father's disappointment that she'd been born a daughter instead of a son, about building her business from the ruins of his criminal empire. And by the time the meeting of the 5 families arrived, something had shifted between the 3 of them. Not love, not yet. Vittoria was too careful and had been hurt too many times to fall that quickly. But the foundation for something: understanding, trust. The recognition that whatever happened next, they were in it together. The meeting was held in a neutral location, a historic hotel in central Naples that had hosted such gatherings for generations. Vittoria arrived with the twins flanking her, wearing a dress that was professional but not submissive, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. The room was full of dangerous men. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging, wondering what this legitimate businesswoman was doing in their world. At the head of the table sat the representatives of the 5 families, and with Don Marco Bruno among them. At the opposite end, smiling like he'd already won, was Antonio Greco. "Gentlemen," Don Marco said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "we are here to address serious allegations against a member of my organization. Antonio Greco has accused me of losing control of my family's operations, allowing weapons trafficking through unauthorized channels, and compromising our relationships with legitimate businesses. Antonio, you have the floor." Antonio stood, and Vittoria had to admire his performance. He presented his evidence smoothly, painting a picture of the Bruno family's leadership as weak and compromised. He showed the shipping manifests, the forged documents, the trail of weapons moving through Castellano vineyards. He made it sound like an operation that could only have happened with high-level approval. "And where is your proof that Don Marco approved this?" asked one of the other family heads. Antonio smiled. "The operation ran through his son's business relationships. Either they approved it, which means Don Marco's control over his own sons is questionable, or they were foolish enough to be used by a civilian businesswoman, which means they're incompetent. Either way, it demonstrates that the Bruno family's leadership is failing." "Miss Castellano," Don Marco said, gesturing to Vittoria, "you've heard these accusations. What do you have to say?" Vittoria stood, feeling every eye in the room lock onto her. This was it. The moment where she either walked away from the mafia world forever or dove back into its depths. "Antonio Greco is a liar," she said clearly, her voice not wavering despite her pounding heart. "He used my business without my knowledge or consent. He forged documentation, manipulated shipping manifests, and manufactured evidence to frame both me and the Bruno family. And when the Bruno brothers discovered his operation and began investigating, he tried to have me killed to prevent me from testifying to this truth." She laid out the evidence methodically, piece by piece. The financial records showing Antonio's embezzlement, the communications proving he'd coordinated the weapons trafficking, the testimony from her warehouse managers about shipments they'd been told not to question, the security footage from her villa showing Antonio's men attempting to kidnap or kill her. As she spoke, she watched Antonio's confident smile slowly crack. The other family heads leaned forward, asking pointed questions that Antonio struggled to answer. The tide was turning. "Why should we believe you?" Antonio demanded, his composure finally breaking. "You're a civilian with no understanding of our world. You could be saying anything the Brunos told you to say." "You're right," Vittoria said calmly. "I am a civilian. I have no ties to organized crime, no stake in your power struggles, and no reason to lie for the Bruno family. Which is exactly why you should believe me. I didn't choose to be part of this. You dragged me into it when you decided to use my business as cover for your crimes. And now, I'm here to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are." The silence that followed was absolute, and then one of the other family heads spoke. "Antonio Greco, you stand accused of embezzlement, unauthorized weapons trafficking, manufacturing evidence against a fellow family, and attempted murder of a civilian to cover your crimes. What do you have to say?" Antonio's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "This is a setup. The Brunos are trying to eliminate me because I threatened their power. Enough, Don Marco said, his voice carrying absolute authority. The evidence is clear. The testimony is credible. You acted without family approval, endangered our relationships with legitimate businesses, and brought unwanted attention to our operations. The penalty for such actions is exile and forfeiture of all assets. It was a death sentence in all but name. Exile from the 5 families meant Antonio would have no protection, no resources, and a very short life expectancy once his enemies realized he was vulnerable. Antonio lunged for Vittoria, his hand going for a concealed weapon, his face twisted with rage. He never made it. Both twins were in motion before he'd taken 2 steps, and suddenly Antonio was on the floor with Raffaele's knee in his back and Rocco's gun to his head. "Take him," Don Marco ordered, and Antonio was dragged from the room, screaming threats and the accusations that no one was listening to anymore. The meeting adjourned shortly after. Vittoria felt drained, wrung out like she'd run a marathon. She'd done it. She testified, exposed Antonio, and survived. Now she could go back to her life. Except when she looked at Rocco and Raffaele, standing together, looking at her with expressions that mixed relief and hope and barely restrained emotion, she realized that going back to her old life wasn't what she wanted anymore. "Gentlemen," Don Marco said, approaching the 3 of them as the room emptied. "Miss Castellano, you have my eternal gratitude. You kept your word, and I'll keep mine. You're free to return to your business with no obligations to this family." "Thank you, Don Bruno," Vittoria said. The old man studied her for a long moment, then looked at his sons. "Although, if you were to choose to have some connection to the Bruno family, not through business but through other means, I wouldn't object. In fact, I would welcome it." He walked away, leaving the 3 of them alone in the emptying room. "What happens now?" Vittoria asked quietly. "Now," Rocco said, "we rebuild your villa. We clear your name publicly. We make sure you can go back to your life without any shadows hanging over you." "And us?" She looked between them. "What happens with us?" Raphael stepped closer, but didn't touch her. "That's entirely up to you. I've told you how I feel. Rocco has been honest about what he's beginning to feel. But we won't pressure you. We won't demand anything. We'll just be here for as long as you want us to be." Vittoria thought about the past few days, the terror and the protection, the late-night conversations and the slowly building trust. The way Rocco's strategic mind complemented Raphael's passionate heart. The way they worked together, 2 halves of a whole, and how being near them made her feel simultaneously safe and terrified. "I'm not ready for declarations," she said honestly. "I'm not ready to make promises or decisions about forever. But I'm not ready to walk away either." "Then don't," Rocco said simply. "Take all the time you need. We're patient men." "I've been waiting 15 years, Raphael added with a slight smile. "I can wait longer if that's what you need." Vittoria found herself smiling back, feeling something in her chest loosen. "Then let's start with dinner, tomorrow night. The 3 of us. No business discussions, no family politics. Just getting to know each other." "We'd like that," both brothers said simultaneously, then looked at each other and laughed. As they walked out of the hotel into the Naples sunshine, Vittoria realized she was stepping into unknown territory. The safe, controlled life she'd built was gone, destroyed by Antonio's machinations. But in its place was something new, something uncertain and potentially complicated, and maybe possibly worth the risk. She thought about that handkerchief, carried for 15 years, as a reminder that kindness existed even in dark times. She thought about Raphael's patient devotion and Rocco's careful respect. She thought about the possibility of building something real with two men who'd already proven they'd protect her with their lives. It was insane. It was impossible. It went against every rule she'd set for herself about staying away from the mafia world. But as Raphael's hand brushed hers, and Rocco opened the car door with a gesture that was both protective and courtly, Vittoria decided that maybe some rules were meant to be broken. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in 5 years, Vittoria Castellano was choosing her path, rather than having it chosen for her. And that made all the difference. 6 months later, Vittoria stood in the rebuilt garden of her villa, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The attack damage had been completely erased, replaced with even more beautiful landscaping and security systems sophisticated enough to stop a small army. Behind her, she heard the sounds of laughter, Rocco and Raphael arguing good-naturedly about something inconsequential, the way they did when they were relaxed and happy. She smiled, turning to watch them. The past 6 months had been a journey of discovery. Dinner dates that turned into long weekends. Business partnerships that evolved into genuine emotional connections. Slowly, carefully, now all 3 of them had navigated the complexity of their situation, finding a rhythm that worked. There had been challenges, jealousies to work through, boundaries to establish, difficult conversations about what their future could look like. But through it all, the foundation they'd built during those crisis days had held strong. "What are you thinking about?" Raphael asked, coming up beside her and wrapping an arm around her waist. "How strange life is," Vittoria replied. "6 months ago, I was running from your world. Now I'm standing in the middle of it, and I've never felt more at home." Rocco joined them, standing on her other side. "Any regrets?" Vittoria considered the question seriously. She'd taken risks, made choices that the woman she'd been a year ago would never have imagined making. She'd opened her heart to not 1 but 2 men, navigating a relationship structure that society would never understand or accept. She tied herself to the Bruno family in ways that couldn't be easily undone. "No regrets," she said finally. "Just gratitude. That sometimes the most impossible choices lead to the most extraordinary outcomes." As the sun disappeared below the horizon and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Vittoria stood between the 2 men who'd become her partners, her protectors, and her future. The path ahead was still uncertain, still complex, still fraught with challenges. But she wasn't facing it alone, and that made all the difference. Did this story capture your heart? If you enjoyed the Bruno twins' devotion, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below sharing your favorite moment from the story. Which brother you connected with most, Team Rocco or Team Raphael? What you'd like to see in future mafia romance stories. Want more epic romance stories? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale of love, loyalty, and impossible choices. Share the love. Know someone who loves mafia romances? Share this story with them, and let's build a community of readers who appreciate complex characters and unconventional love stories. Your engagement helps me create more stories like this one. Thank you for reading.